Quick, come with me. It's actually been 13 years and Michael Bay has taken over Star Trek. I know you don't remember because the episodes were so bad, it erased your memory. So you gotta tell me where I can find good Star Trek. You gotta tell me. Really, it's been 13 years. Tell me. Ah! Fooled you. It hasn't been 13 years. Haha. I was just pretending. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Stratagem, which is episode 14 of season 3 of Star Trek Enterprise. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll for Star Trek Enterprise is the episode Stratagem. So in this episode, Archer captures Dagra and wants to find out where he's building the weapon. However, Dagra is very tight-lipped and isn't talking, so he uses the information he captured on his database in order to create a ruse to make Dagra think that he wakes up 3 years into the future after they've been held prisoner by the insectoids who had turned on the rest of the Xindi. However, Dagra soon discovers this deception and becomes once again tight-lipped. However, in that time, Dagra had punched in coordinates for the location of where they're building the weapon, but Archer doesn't know whether or not to believe this, so he creates yet another ruse to make Dagra think that the Enterprise has discovered how to use the Xindi's transwarp thingies or whatever the hell they call them, but they didn't really. It was just a ruse to see what Dagra's reaction would be, and of course Dagra gives away that the coordinates he gave them are in fact the correct ones. So then he erases Dagra's memory and sends him back on his merry way to be picked up by the Xindi, having no memory of the events that occurred on the Enterprise. So I really like this episode. I've always liked this episode. I talked about this before many times on my channel, I'm sure, about how when I first saw season 3 of Enterprise, I watched it out of order, which is a damn shame considering how serialized it is, and it's the one season that happened to air during a turbulent time in my life, and I wasn't able to watch it completely in order. However, this was one of the episodes I did see as it aired, when it first aired. And it's funny because the episode that aired the previous week before this, right before this Proving Ground, which this episode kind of carries on from, that was like the last episode of the season that I saw. I saw that like after I saw everything else. So yeah, I saw it in a really funky order. But this is what, I remember seeing this episode very clearly, and I remember really loving it, and I remember this was what gave me hope for the Xindi story arc. This was made me think, well, this story arc actually could be really, really good. Now, I have recently been watching reviews and other stuff on season 3 of Enterprise, and reviews that, let's say, are a lot more negative than what I think. And it's not just this one review, although I see this opinion a lot recently on the net, that the first half of season 3 was not very good, and that the Xindi story arc didn't really pick up until the second half of season 3, and I can see that. Like, I can definitely see the first half, and I think I mentioned that myself too, that the first half was slower and it had a lot more filler episodes that had nothing to do with anything. It had that stupid one with the dude who was creeping on Hoshi, or the hot chick that was like trying to gather information by making out with the pole, or the the one when they went to the Western and it was a very stupid allegory, obvious allegory that they just wanted to have an excuse to have a Western, had absolutely nothing to do with anything. Or those other dudes who were very blatantly Al-Qaeda who came on the ship and was tried to take it over with suicide bombs. Like, all that shit didn't really have to do anything to do with anything. Now, sure, the second half of the season has a couple episodes like that. You have the 2 episodes after this one, Doctor's Order and the I can't even remember the name of it, but the one where Archer becomes obsessed with insectoid babies. Like, those didn't really have anything to do with anything either. They were kind of asides. But at least the one with the insectoid babies kind of... I mean, I would argue the one with the insectoid babies at least had something to do with the Xindi and explored the Xindi more, so there's that. And then towards the end of the season, you also have E2, which I think is a bit a waste of time and just a rip-off of Children of Time. But there was definitely there was definitely more filler in the first half, and the first half definitely took a bit longer it took a really long time. It's been a long It took a long time for it to get the story going. And but in the end of season 3, even though there are still a couple filler episodes, once the story kicks in, it goes into overdrive. Whereas the first half, it creeped at a very, very slow speed. But I don't think that the first half of season 3 was horrible. Like, I see this opinion like the first half of season 3 was absolutely terrible, and therefore season 3 isn't a great season because the first half wasn't any good, which is an opinion I completely disagree with. I think there are some really great moments, some really great episodes, and really great aspects of Season 3. In fact, some of these so-called filler episodes that don't really have anything to do with the main storyline, such as Similitude and Twilight, I think are amazing episodes. So I disagree, and I think it's obvious that from our opinion of the episode, I just like some of these episodes. Like, I've heard people trash the hell out of Carpenter Street, which I think is an amazing episode. I don't care what anyone says, but I already talked about that on my channel. But yeah, so the point is, I think that season 3 is... I talked about it when I did my season 3 review of Enterprise as a whole. I think it is one of the best seasons in the entire Star Trek franchise. A top 5 for me of the entire Star Trek franchise, and I stand firmly by that opinion. I don't care what anyone says. Anyway, Stratagem, however, this is kind of the turning point of the season. Now, some people could argue that Azadi Prime is the turning point of the season, but I think this, chronologically, this is closer to the midpoint. In fact, it is slightly after the midpoint. I think the exact midpoint was that one with Digimon and those dudes who tried to take over the Enterprise with bombs because they worship the spheres. But that's not, narratively, that's not the midpoint of the season. That's just technically, I think this episode is more technically the midpoint of the season. This is, or narratively I should say, this is where the story really starts to change from the first half of Enterprise trying to find the Xindi to them having a purpose. They're like, the first half, they're kind of just searching aimlessly. And of course, the main drive is the fact that they find the coordinates to where the weapon is being built. In this episode, and it's on a planet called Azadi Prime, and then we spend 2 episodes getting to Azadi Prime, and once they're there, that's like a huge, big battle conclusion episode, and then things skyrocket from there until the end of the season. So I think this is, I would argue this is the midpoint of the season. This is narratively speaking, and I think it really works that way, because also this is when we've met Daygriff before, we've seen him before, we saw him in the previous episode proving ground a bit, and even before that, since the start of the season when they had these asides with the Xindi, and then Archer has seen him before in the episode Shipment, but this is the first time they really start to delve into this character, and he will become a very important character for the rest of the season, and this is basically where it began. Did I say they take 2 episodes to get to Azadi Prime? They actually take 3. I forgot about Harbinger. That's another one. I forgot I left that one out, so they took 3 episodes to get to the Azadi Prime. But anyway, regardless, so I like that. And I love that episode 4 that we explored Dagger's character more, and this is where the Xindi story arc really kicks in. But looking at this episode individually as its own thing, I love it as an example of Enterprise episode. To me, this is why I think, and it's part of the reason, not the whole reason, because there's many reasons, but this part of the reason why I think season 3 is far, far, far superior than 1 or 2 of Enterprise. And it's because, and part of the reason why I hated the first 2 seasons of Enterprise so much, and this is what I talked about on my channel a lot, is that the crew were incompetent. Now, I've heard the obvious pushback, which is nonsense, but I'll address it. And the obvious pushback is, well, Mark, they're the first humans in space. Of course, they're going to be a bit naive of the ways of space, which is true. But that's not... that goes way beyond this, and I'm sick of explaining this. To me, it's self-evident. It's not just that they're naive of the way of space, it's that they're morons with no common sense. That if you put people in the 21st century who knew nothing about like space, or let's say astronauts who are sort of primitive space technology compared to the 22nd century Enterprise technology, they would be completely out of their element. And yet, I think they would do, and especially get like the smartest people with high IQs who know about astrophysics and stuff like that, they would be like 1 billion times smarter and they would handle things better than the crew of Enterprise, at least as portrayed in the first 2 seasons, because they have no common sense and they're morons. Ugh. I mean, what I'm saying, yeah, you get smarter people who are actually more naive to the ways of space and aliens and the world presented in this show, and they still handle the situation way better than these idiots did. Anyway, sorry. But that's the difference between this episode, because they're not morons. That is the main difference between season 3 and the first 2 seasons, is that they're no longer morons. And it's because in the first 2 seasons, they were trying too hard to portray them as naive to the ways of space, and they ended up portraying them as a bunch of idiots who didn't know what the hell they're doing. But in season 3, they stopped doing that because the focus of the show was no longer these first humans of space who are naive. It was more of a 9/11 allegory of, we gotta stop these aliens from destroying Earth. And so, this episode in particular, the crew is actually very smart and witty. Archer, now you could argue that it's inconsistent with how Archer's been portrayed in the show thus far, but I'm fine with that because the way he's been portrayed in the show thus far was bullshit. So I'm okay with him course correcting and making him actually a smart and witty character who's worthy of being a starship captain instead of some moron who doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. So I'm perfectly okay with that retcon, and because I see it as less of a retcon and more as a correction, as something that season 3 and 4 will do a lot. They got to course correct the terribleness of the first 2 seasons. But this episode in particular is, I love this is a common theme with Star Trek captains too. You see it a lot with Kirk and Picard and Janeway, where they're really witty and they're able to not to just negotiate or out brawn or fight their way through, but they're able to defeat their opponents by outwitting them. And I think it's amazing to see Archer do this in this episode, and I mainly love that the way he plays that deception on Degra and really sells it to him. And I love the way that this episode is presented. It does remind me a lot of the TNG episode Future Imperfect. And if I may be so bold, I think this episode's even better than that, because in both episodes you're presented as an audience, you're presented with what we're told as the audience is the future, is a possible future. And then as the episode carries on, you find out that it's not a future, it's just a delusion. Now, in the case of Future Imperfect, it was just some lonely kid, and they had to fake out with the Romulans, but it wasn't the Romulans, it was just some lonely kid who lost his family, some refugee, which to me that's not as interesting as the captain who is actually using the ruse in order to gather intelligence. much needed intelligence to save the human race. That to me is a way more interesting concept than just some lonely refugee, which is why I think this is a better episode than Future Imperfect. And also because it has a different dynamic than Future Imperfect, because it's our crew, our heroes themselves, who are the one who is putting on this deception. But I love the structure of it, that we, the audience, don't know that this is deception. And we're thinking, oh, it was another time travel. We just did this with like Twilight. There's alternate realities where a human race is wiped out. But we find out that it's all a bunch of bullshit that Archer made up. Now, how realistic is it that they would choose a scenario so outlandish and that they would actually be able to sell this to Degra? I don't know, but I don't care, because it's great storytelling, and I love the way it works. It's great seeing, and this is, of course, in the sense of the overall story of Season 3, is very vital, because this is when Archer starts to know Degra. This, as I said, this is when they start portraying Degra as a three-dimensional, dynamic, interesting character. The way that he regrets, like, he loves his children, and he regrets the fact that destroying Earth, that he could have killed a bunch. He wondered how many children that I killed, but he's just pushed in a corner, and from his perspective, it's what he needs to do to save his children. And so that humanizes the enemy, where the Xindi aren't just these evil, mustache-twirly, gotta kill people because they're bad, blah, evil things. It's a person with his own feelings, own dynamic, own motivations, which, by the way, is something I love about Season 3 at all. Even Dalam, the reptilian who's appears later in the show, is portrayed kind of a little bit mustache twirly, but even him, like, I would argue, they portray his motivation, and which of course is a lot of self-centered, ambitious, power hungry, but there's a lot of people like that, and I think that actually is a very realistic and dynamic villain, I would argue. So that's what I love about the whole Xindi story arc, is that these aren't just mindless evil demons, that monsters or the dark side that we need to defeat. It is dynamic people with their own backgrounds and histories that somehow puts them at conflict with Archer, and Archer has to negotiate and work with them and understand them in order to eventually overcome them. Now, at this stage in the season, he hasn't gotten there yet. He's still at the, I gotta outwit them, outsmart them, and defeat them, but this is laying the groundwork. His interactions with Degra and getting to know the man, even though it's through the lens of this deception, is what lays the groundwork for him eventually being able to build a bridge later in the season and call him an ally. So I absolutely love that. I think it's dynamic. I love as I said, I love the structure of the episode. I love how we start with them making us think they're in the future, but then they show Archer go out and you see the whole thing is like a Disneyland, right? Whenever on the hydraulics going, and I love how then we flash back to the start of the events of the episode where they find Degra. I love that structure. I think it's brilliant, and I think it really sort of tells the story great. And what I love most of all is when Degra figures it out. And after he punches in the coordinates, but we, the audience, don't know if he figured it out before. And we the audience see that he solves a blip, and when the Disneyland ride malfunction. So I think we, the audience, can piece together that he didn't figure it out until then, but he lies to Archer and tells him, which is very smart for him, by the way, that he figured it out before then. So Archer is unsure. And what I love most about this episode, which I think to me is the best part, is how Archer fools him again and plays another deception. And again, we the audience are not in on it. Like, we don't know, like, because we see Archer, like, what is the possibility that we can recreate, the Xindi subspace or whatever bullshit is called, way to travel very fast, and Tucker's like, well, we'll never be able to do it, and he's like, now bring me all the information you have on it. So, and then we jump straight from that into them actually doing it. So it seems from a narrative perspective that they figured out how to do it, but they're just not very good at it, and the ship's falling apart and they're not doing very well. But turns out they didn't even try to do it. They just wanted to simulate trying to do it to convince Dagra that that's what they were doing, and they fooled them again. Like that moment where, like, they arrive at the Red Dwarf and Dagra starts, "You'll never find a weapon, we'll stop you!" And Archer's like, thanks. And then they reveal they're actually still there. I mean, that was fucking amazing. I love that. I love these sort of the outwitting deception things. It reminds me of like Picard in the episode The Survivors, or Kirk in the Cobonite maneuver. And I think it works very well here. And I think this is a way better version of Archer than that pansy that we got in the first 2 seasons. Or that moron, I should say. So this is why the show's better. This is why, objectively, Season 3 is far superior than the first 2 seasons. Anyone who thinks otherwise is just objectively wrong. I am sorry. But they are. They are. It's a fact of life. Anyway. Also, I gotta talk about Manny Koto. Because I looked this up, and because I was curious of when he actually started on Enterprise, because I knew it was partway through season 3, but if he officially was credited for as co-producer in the episode Exile, which was way back as like episode 6 or something, so it was before this. But I have a feeling, and from what I heard, it seems to be the case that he slowly over the course of season 3 was taking over, becoming more prominent, and that Brennan Braga and Rick Berman were being slowly pushed out, which is of course a good thing. I think it explains why the second half of season 3 is better than the first half, is because Manny Koto was more prominent in that part, and also explains why season 3 and 4 were far superior to 1 and 2, because that was Rick Berman, Brennan Braga, and Rick Berman is a disaster to Star Trek. Everything, I mean, not everything he did was terrible. He has contributed some good things, but he held back Voyager, and his whole premise of Enterprise was awful. He's not a creative mind. He should never been put in charge. And Brennan Braga, and I talked about, and I'll probably talk about him a lot more. Great writer. He wrote some of the best episodes of Star Trek, but he's not a good showrunner at all. So, and in fact, and I'm sure I'll mention this a bunch more times too, but Brennan Braga even stated that Manny Koto should have been the one who was running Enterprise from the beginning, and he's absolutely correct. And now Manny Koto is not credited with writing this episode. He was credited as a co-producer, so I have a feeling that his influence is what helped create a great episode like this and portray a smart crew of witty, smart people you can get behind, rather than these morons we saw in season 1 and 2. Bland cardboard cutout morons we saw in the first 2 seasons. Anywho, my rating for Stratagem out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. I really like this episode. I think it contributes to the Xindi storyline as a whole. I think it sets up perfectly for developing Dagra and the type of person he is, portraying him as a more dynamic character, not just a two-dimensional villain, which will really become important later in the season. And the whole way that they fake out the audience with the Future Imperfect type twist, I think was done better in Future Imperfect, and it's done because it's done in a way that shows how witty and how our crew, our heroes, Archer, managed to outsmart and outwit their opponent, which is something that they desperately needed, and I think is something very satisfying about watching that. And as I said, that second deception, I still thought that was perfect. Anyway, so that's it for my review of Stratagem. I shall return to review more random episodes of Star Trek, so check out my channel for that, as well as covering many other shows like The Expanse, Better Call Saul, Star Wars, Clone Wars, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.